All right. We have a very interesting guest today. Dushko Petrovich is a New York-based artist and writer who was born in Quito, Ecuador. He received his BA from Yale and his MFA from Boston University before going on to serve as the Star Scholar, or Scholar and Artist in Residence, at the Royal Academy of Arts in London. He has exhibited his work at venues including the Kiji Dome and the De Cordova Museum in Boston, Soloway, D.C. Moore and Rachel Uthner Gallery in New York, the Suburban in Chicago, and the Institute of Contemporary Art in Philadelphia. In addition to writing for Book Forum, Slate, Modern Painters, and the Boston Globe, he currently chairs the N+1 Foundation's Board of Directors and is a co-founder of Paper Monument, where he has co-edited many publications, including I Like Your Work, Art and Etiquette, Draw It With Your Eyes Closed, The Art of the Art Assignment. He teaches at Boston University, RISD, and Yale. It sounds like I could benefit from taking some of his classes. Please join me in welcoming Dushko Petrovich.
Thanks. Thank you for having me today. Thank you to George for inviting me. The first question, maybe not on your mind, but on my mind, was in what way could what I do be considered design? So I wanted to talk a little bit first about my thinking, such as it is, about design, and I wanted to use this example of EMIGRE magazine, which you guys may or may not know, but EMIGRE was the preeminent design thinking magazine sort of from the late 80s through the 90s. And I got interested in EMIGRE almost for the wrong reasons, you could say, because I started looking into it, and one of the things that nobody talks about with EMIGRE magazine is that actually for the first 8 issues, it wasn't a magazine about design, it was a magazine about being an émigré, which is to say about, you know, going to a different country and living in a different country, being a foreigner. And I was asked by SF MoMA to write a piece for them, and I took up this question of EMIGRE magazine, and I found myself getting really involved with how it had started off as a very bad idea, like a kind of impossible project where you couldn't possibly imagine selling the ads or reaching the audience in the correct way or anything like that. And so EMIGRE slowly turned into a design magazine. And then what people remember is like issues 8 through, I forget what it was, but for decades going forward. And so I looked into this, and I became really fond of what I call the EMIGRE, the first kind of phase of the magazine where it was still a very bad idea and very interesting because of how it was struggling to put things together. I mean, I guess the other thing that EMIGRE is known for is for being one of the first magazines to be put together on a desktop computer. That's what people talk about. But anyways, I'm quite interested in the other thing, which was the bad idea of having a magazine that was for émigrés and the strange effort to try to make that work. I started a magazine together with my friend Roger White in 2007 called Paper Monument. When you start something, I think you have to believe that it's somehow necessary in the world, and it usually isn't. But you kind of convince yourself, and now people ask us why we started it, and we don't even totally remember how we convinced ourselves. But I think the idea with Paper Monument, the overall idea was that in art writing, there was academic art writing, and then there was commercial art writing. And both of those things are very functional, and they do what they're supposed to do, and they're extremely useful. But we also found that there were kinds of writing and kinds of art that didn't fit comfortably into those categories, and we had the idea that we could publish writing that was in that big gap, you could say, between academic and commercial writing. which I think is a good idea. The difficult part is sustaining that in some way, obviously, because when it comes to money and that kind of stability, you start to understand why magazines are connected either to universities or to large advertisers. So we've maintained a very different model, which is in no way a for-profit model. It's very much a non-profit model, but we've managed to stay in business, so to speak, in between these two large categories. In terms of design, in a more conventional sense, one of our goals with Paper Monument was to elevate the visuals more and try to put them somewhat on equal footing with the writing. Because one of the aspects of magazines generally is that they're a combination of visual and written material. Everybody knows this, any magazine has this, but the editorial, the writing people are always in charge, which produces good writing, but it doesn't always produce the best visuals. So we wanted to, especially because it was an art magazine, we wanted to try to put those things on more equal footing. And the way we did it was, I chose this slide because you can sort of see on the right is a glossy color stock paper, and on the left was a one color printing matte paper. So the magazine itself has different kinds of paper, and we spend the money on the color glossy paper that's much more expensive, and then the other kind of paper is cheaper, and then it all kind of nestles together in alternation. So when the artworks appear, they just appear fully. They take up the whole page, there's no writing about them, and they just stand on their own feet, which confuses people to no end, because normally in an art magazine, if you have a picture, then there's a lot of writing about the image. So it confuses people, but that's the structure, the kind of physical design structure of Paper Monument. The other thing which comes out, I think, a little bit in the name is that we knew we were doing something kind of against the flow, in 2007 to make an actual paper magazine. Everybody else was going in a very digital direction. And rather than think like, oh, that's the end of publishing or I don't know, even rather than thinking that the internet was going to give us great freedom, which it definitely has, we sort of thought, well, wouldn't it be interesting to kind of move in a kind of counterpunctual way, like move out of time a little bit and see what kind of space was opening up for printing on paper and publishing physical books at this particular moment. So that's kind of, Paper Monument is obviously a kind of self-contradictory, self-effacing kind of name. And that was the idea that we had, which was that if everyone else is speeding up and moving digital and putting things out more on a daily or weekly schedule, or on a schedule that's connected to exhibitions and gallery programming, if we moved off that a little bit and published more slowly, we might be able to do something different. Oftentimes we publish entirely too slowly, which is a problem, but that is the kind of one of the design, I guess, ideas behind Paper Monument as a journal. And it may seem like a logical step, given what I've just said, to move from publishing a journal to publishing books if you're interested in something that's slower and more considered and will last longer. But we didn't really expect to publish books. In fact, we were artists. We didn't expect to publish a journal. We ended up doing that, and then at a certain point, we realized, well, if you know how to print a magazine, if you know how to make a magazine, you kind of know how to make a book. You basically take out all the pictures and take out the part that says when it was put out, and then it's more like a book. So we decided we could make a book kind of in the way that we made a magazine. And this also confuses people because people will refer to our books and they'll say, that issue you guys did, the issue you did about manners. And oh yeah, the book, okay. So there's a kind of confusion, and I think it's warranted because we made these books kind of in the way that you would make a magazine, which is to say that we reached out to a lot of different people to talk about a common theme, which happens all the time in magazines. But instead of putting it out like as the January issue of something, we just put it out as a book. And the first one we did, I think this was from 2009, somewhere around there. It's called I Like Your Work, Art and Etiquette. And this was another kind of foundational idea of Paper Monument, was that we wanted to take things that we heard people talking about, but we never saw in the public record. That was one of our main concerns, was to take things that we heard, that we knew people were worrying about, that they were thinking about, but of course there would be no reason really to talk about it publicly, either because it wouldn't be profitable, it would be embarrassing, it would be difficult, all these kinds of things. So we sort of started maybe with something of a light topic, which was manners, because I don't know how far you guys are into the art world or if you're even that involved, but in the art world is a kind of twilight zone of manners where all the regular things you learned about manners are, they don't really work in the art world. If you're an artist, you're sort of supposed to not do things in the conventional way, but at the same time, that not doing things also has its own conventions, and so it's a very tricky thing, and then people are often just outright rude and horrible as well in the art world. So we had this kind of double goal with this book, which was to, on the one hand, provide something that was a kind of useful guide for navigating difficult social situations, and then on the other hand, also critique and make fun of that social world at the same time that we were helping people navigate it. So it's sort of half useful book that we made. And much to our surprise, it was really, really popular. We made it on a small scale and, out of our own interest and commitment, and then it turns out a lot of people like it. I think it's like a very, like a bathroom book, really, in the art world. Like you go to someone's bathroom and then they have this book sitting in there so you can kind of flip through it. And in terms of design, one of the things we thought with this was that it should look kind of like an etiquette book or something, so we based it more or less off the Zagat format, and it was something like you could put in your pocket. It was like our kind of physical idea. And then an interesting thing happened, actually, which was that when Occupy Wall Street started happening, the Declaration of the Occupation of New York City was published in a format that was exactly like this, and then, which we were really flattered by and excited about, and until people started accusing us of stealing Occupy Wall Street's visuals, and then we had to tweet like we did this years ago, so people weren't confused. So that was kind of an interesting twist. The second book we did is called Draw It With Your Eyes Closed, The Art of the Art Assignment. And we said about this a little bit like you could imagine a band who makes a pop song that is really successful and really doesn't like how successful it became and would rather do something really serious and not so popular. So we thought if everyone liked talking about etiquette, what they really wouldn't like talking about is pedagogy, So we wanted to do a book about art school, and one of the things that we noticed about the books that existed about art school is that they were extremely theoretical, and for us, they really lacked the texture of what really happens in art school. Again, this is part of our ethos is to actually try to capture things as they transpire in the real world. And we tried to think how we could capture some of the really nitty-gritty things that actually happen when you're trying to learn art or trying to learn how to be an artist or learn how to be creative. And we ended up centering on the assignment, partly because, in my experience at least, there were three kinds of artists teachers. One were artists who were really committed to their art and really good at their art, and then really bad at teaching. They didn't put any effort into it, or they just weren't good at it, and you could just tell. And they can survive because they were well-known or successful as artists. And then there were a lot of people who were really good at teaching and put a lot of their energy into that, but they weren't really making a lot of art. They didn't have the energy left over or the time or whatever. And Roger, my co-editor, and I, we both wanted to be the third kind, which was people who both made interesting work and were competent, interesting, good teachers. And we noticed that in and of itself is a kind of design problem. Like, how do you organize your life so you can do both of these things? And we realized that one of the main things you needed was to have really good assignments. And we noticed also that there was a kind of black market in assignments where you would call your friends and talk about these problems. And most of the art world functions on this kind of oral tradition still, stories, phone calls, talking about things at the bar. And we wanted to take some of those things and make them more widely available, right? Because it didn't strike us as fair or efficient or good that you would have to know John Baltasari and call him and, ask him about stuff. We wanted to sort of open source these things a little bit. So we put together this book, again, which we thought would be an unpopular, dry book for our friends who were suffering from the same kind of problems that we were, which was, surviving as a teacher and as an artist. And we got many good reviews in arts publications, and then we got a really glowing review in the New York Times. And it became, I think partly because people like to make fun of art, but anyways, it became the number 3 most emailed thing at the New York Times, and at a certain point it was number 31 or something like that on Amazon, which was utterly mind-blowing. I remember we passed like Bill O'Reilly, which was amazing, and we passed whoever that Swedish guy is who writes all those mystery books. We passed him, and then we peaked right below Dr. Seuss. We never passed Dr. Seuss, which we decided was good. We didn't want to pass Dr. Seuss. So this book ended up being an incredible success. I think people like it because it's candid, it's varied, it's useful in a strange way, I think, to read all these various assignments and stories and failures and all these different kinds of things. And people often ask me in terms of, I guess, design, but in the editorial side of design, like, well, how do you do that? How do you edit something like that? I mean, and the annoying answer is, well, you have to be me and Roger, and you have to kind of know each other for a long time, and there are things that are very difficult to describe. But I do tell people one thing, which is that we include all the responses that we get. And that usually surprises people because they think like the main thing would be to cut out people, like to kind of, and I guess we do that in a way by who we invite, right? We make decisions about who we invite. But once we get things in, it goes in. And we do that partly because of this thing I heard one time on the radio. Someone was talking to a gospel choir leader, a choir master, I guess. And they said, well, why does gospel sound so good, And she said, oh, we let everybody sing, and that just struck me as being very profound. And we try to do that. So, one of the things about it is that we don't actually believe in all the things that we publish. We don't actually even think that it's all good. There are many things that we think are bad. But we include them because we make this kind of picture of a situation. So, and I think that's that's a very uncommon approach to editing. I think it's probably the opposite of most people's approach to editing, and we have the freedom to do that partly, I think, because we're artists and we have the means of production. We publish the books ourselves, so nobody tells us, well, that's not marketable or that's not smart, right? So recently, so we sort of moved oddly from making a journal to making these kind of what we call like group books. To now we have our first single author book, which we just published this fall, and it's called The Miraculous by Raphael Rubinstein. And this was just the picture I had, which was from the New York Art Book Fair, where we were selling all of our stuff. But that's The Miraculous in the front there. And The Miraculous happened in this interesting way, which was that Raphael Rubinstein had written it, and he brought it to us because he felt like it resembled, in a funny way, our other books, because it's a series of stories about art history, more or less, about these conceptual and performance art pieces. And the interesting thing, the brilliant thing that Raphael decided to do was he retells these stories, but he takes out the name of the artist. So some of the stories are very well known, art historical events featuring very famous artists, and some are lesser known events featuring artists that people don't necessarily know about. And then they're all kind of put together and they form this kind of strange network of activities. And I mean, I sort of sensed right away that was a very interesting approach, and having edited it and published it, and even now, thinking about it more and more, it sort of dawned on me in waves why that was so smart. And I think one of the reasons it's so smart is that in art school, oftentimes what people teach you are names. They teach you names of artists, and you learn about these artists, and you learn about what they did, but you always attach it back to the name, which of course is useful, and every artist should be attached to their work in that way. But one of the things that happens is that the strangeness of the work can kind of get worn away by this kind of branding. You think, oh well, Marina Abramovich did that, so that's just her thing. It's not. It stops being as weird as it would be if you just thought like, okay, what does it mean? For example, Marina Abramovich, she put herself on a table and arranged all these objects, including a gun and a knife and food and everything on this table, and said, anyone can do to me whatever they want, which is, still a really radical kind of thing. Maybe if you're hearing this for the first time, it will hit you as a kind of radical approach to art and life. But now, in the art world, that story has been told so many times that it kind of loses its initial strangeness. So one of the reasons I was really excited to publish this was because this book kind of returns some of the strangeness of the original works to the work, and is by separating it from the name. So I've been trying to think like, what's the design here? And I think that's part of the design of this book, was to take out the names. And then they happen at the end. They're indexed at the end of the book, and they're all factually true, and you can check it out afterwards, but you sort of read through the whole book without thinking about the exact person that did that work. This is another editorial project I did. This one I did by myself. This is Art Papers, which is a long-standing arts magazine published out of Atlanta. And they were having guest editors last year, and they invited me to guest edit an issue, which was interesting because it was fun to kind of guest edit. It would be like, getting to stay in someone else's house, or drive someone else's car, or something like that. It was kind of exciting in that way. But it put me in a difficult position, which was that I didn't want to use any of my good ideas for someone, I didn't want to use my paper monument ideas for Art Papers. It kind of put me in this weird position, which I really struggled with for a while. And eventually it hit me that one of the things I could do, and maybe the only thing I could do really, was to do an art magazine about art magazines. because then there would be like a reason why I was sort of sitting in this other magazine, you know. The other guest editors they had were like curators and whatever. They didn't normally edit magazines, so it was a kind of strange situation for me. And I proposed this, and they liked the idea, which was great, because it gave me a chance to kind of reflect on all these things that I think about editing an art magazine in another art magazine, right, with the staff and the support that they had, and the freedom to do things also in a way like outside of what I established with Roger at Paper Monument. So yeah, it was interesting. The cover here is it's maybe not big enough for you to see, but it's a kind of listing of, like you would get from a distributor, of all the art magazines that are available for like Barnes and Noble or whatever to show. And then we highlighted the ones that were in the issue, that were discussed in the issue itself, so quite a few. And then we had the little loop-de-loop, the red proofreader's mark that means take out for any of the magazines that were no longer published. So that's the cover. And then I was just going to talk about a couple of the pieces that I did, again, to think a little bit about a kind of design, I guess, approach. This is this piece I commissioned from Jeremy Sigler, who is a very interesting poet, and also he had been an editor at Parquet, which is a major art magazine. And so I thought, well, Jeremy's a good person. He's extremely candid. He has a very strange approach where you don't quite know if he's telling the truth or not. It's very kind of rambling, and oftentimes he says things that are really embarrassing. So you sort of wonder whether it's true or not. So I thought, oh, Jeremy's perfect. Like he's gonna say the things that everyone else is afraid to say. He's gonna tell stories about expense accounts and love affairs and fights and everything like that everyone else is obviously gonna avoid. So as I expected, Jeremy Sigler came through with this piece, which was even worse, in that way than I'd wanted. So it was a kind of, I think he probably knew too that I was wanting this, and then he decided to punish me by giving me too much. And the problem with Jeremy, I realized, was that if you start editing him, you're never going to stop. Like, he sent me this thing which had typos and profanities and misspellings and gossip and things about like cheating on people and getting fired and all this stuff. And I just thought, if I touch that comma, then the question becomes, why didn't you touch all the other stuff? So again, it was like this weird thing where I put myself in this very difficult, kind of impossible situation. And I honestly didn't know what to do for a while. I thought, oh, Jeremy's he's punishing me here. He's giving me this, it's also like an editor to editor, like kind of throwdown situation. And I finally came up with a solution, which was, I said, Jeremy, I just have one edit, which is, can I do the title? And ordinarily editors do the title in newspapers and magazines. It's usually a given, unless you're like a superstar writer. Maybe you can negotiate to do your own titles, but editors oftentimes get to do titles. So, it was kind of within the rules of editing too. I said, Jer, I just have this one thing. Can I title it? He said, yeah, sure, no problem. And when I asked him about editing it, I said, how far do you want me to go with this? This isn't a good part of the story. And Jeremy said, I totally trust you. Which was also, again, kind of a, it was a trick. So I said, yeah, I'll just do the title. And he said, okay, super. So I titled it Unedited. And then I had them write that in big red, script at the top of the piece. So then what follows underneath is Jeremy's unedited piece about working at Parquet, which you should all read. In a totally different vein, this was the first time I worked with Raphael Rubinstein. Raphael wrote this great piece called Other People's Prose. He had been an editor at Art in America for about 10 or 15 years, and he wrote a great piece about, again, similar to Jeremy's in subject matter, but utterly different in approach, about all the different kinds of situations that you would get into at an art magazine. And one of my favorite ideas that came out of this was that one of the kind of fictions of publishing and of magazines especially was that it's really a group enterprise. And any text has so many people's thinking and fact-checking and proofreading and editing and developing. Oftentimes the idea is from the editor, not from the author. You know, there's a real collaborative process, but then in the end, the author gets pushed forward, you know, in the same way that like a superstar athlete or, you know, maybe in the theater too, like this person gets pushed forward. And Raphael made the really good point that we live in this era theoretically of the death of the author, which Roland Barthes discussed, and the birth of the reader, but in fact we really maintain this idea of authorial independence. And isn't that funny that editors do that? And a lot of editors like that. I mean, that's one of kind of the fun of editing in a way, is that you can then drop back and let the author, you know, let the author move forward. But I thought it was an interesting reflection on what it meant to edit, and also in terms of what it means to design, really, because when you're editing, it's one of these jobs where the less people think about you, the better. Like, you know, you almost, you need to remove yourself by doing it. You know, you need to, a piece cannot look edited. That would be the worst outcome. You know, you need it to appear like it just came out of the author. So it's a kind of a tricky thing where you have to cover your tracks, and you know, it's almost criminal, and it's kind of covering up, you know, like you're like a cat burglar. You have to go in and out of the text without anyone being able to trace your steps. So I think that's quite an interesting idea. I wanted to talk a little bit about my own artistic work. So this is a piece called El Oso Carnal. And as George had mentioned, I was born in Ecuador and I left when I was 6. And I'd always wanted to address that somehow in my painting, and even in writing, and I didn't really know how to. And one day about 2 years ago, I realized that my own visual education and my own affinities were formed very early, you know, as is true for everyone. And in my case, one of the things I really liked was these Ecuadorian buses. I don't know if you've traveled in Latin America. There are different parts of the world where the buses are kind of hand designed and hand painted. Someone will own their bus route or their little bus, and they will paint them. And you know, I liked a lot of things about that. One of the things I liked was that you could kind of put many different kinds of things into one visual space, you know, which is something I like to do. As you can tell, I like to do a lot of different things, and I like this idea of putting religion and sports and personal history and commerce and technology all kind of in the same space. But of course, in my case, I left Ecuador, and most of the things, you know, that I do consciously or associate with or kind of came about after I left. And so what I decided to do was to put all those experiences that happened after I left in the visual terms of an Ecuadorian bus, which is something I would have like learned, a kind of visual system I would have learned before I left. So what happens on the bus are all these things in English. I happen to be a Korean lineage student of Buddhism, so there's some Korean transliterations of Sanskrit, there's English stuff, there's stuff in Italian, Danish, different things that I experienced that are like non-Ecuadorian kinds of things put into this thing. And I called it El Oso Carnal because I have a friend of mine who, that's his nickname for me, and it means the carnal bear, and he would make fun of me by narrating my activities as if I was in a nature program, saying like, El Oso Carnal tiene hambre, El Oso Carnal, you know, like whatever. So I just took him up on that. I like that kind of thing, like flipping it. So this is just a detail which includes my high school and junior high mascots. This is another project in terms of, you know, in thinking a little bit about design. I decided to start making these plaid paintings. And the reason I mean, I like plaid. I'm wearing a few plaids for you today. I probably wear plaid every day. I think it's a fairly ubiquitous fabric. For me, it was also a fabric that I encountered when I came to the U.S. So it was a kind of interesting question for me about assimilation and about how far I had gone with this American thing. And it interested me visually too, because it was this kind of intersection. And on another level, what interested me was that it was a kind of abstract painting. Clearly, it wasn't a representation of something, but at the same time, you couldn't read it as an abstract painting. I mean, you have to kind of force yourself to remember that it's a painting. You have to, it's explicitly made out of paint. You can't see here, but they're quite kind of painted with brush strokes and everything like that. But the mind doesn't kind of accept it as a painting, and I really like that as just as a way of operating, to kind of very very quickly move into this in between space, which I think now that I'm talking is a common strategy that I take. And I was working together again with my friend Roger, who edits Paper Monument with me. We did this project, Regionalism, for the DeCordova Museum here in Boston, because they had asked us to be in the regional biennial. And neither of us was from New England, so we had a kind of mixed feeling about this, right? Like, we will neither confirm nor deny that we're New Englanders, or, it was like, how does it really connect? So we decided with our project to make these paintings. Roger painted lobsters, I painted plaids, so we figured we kind of had it covered. And we then sent the paintings around to where we were from. So Roger's from Salinas, California, and I'm from Quito, Ecuador, so we sent the paintings on this journey. So here, in this slide, you have a picture of, this is my plaid painting here in the middle, at this park, El Ejido, which is like, when I was growing up, that's where you would see people selling paintings, and still to this day, people on a Saturday will go and sell their paintings there. So I thought it would be interesting to put this painting back into like where, as a child, I would have seen paintings. And then once we brought everything back to Boston, we made this pamphlet called Regionalism, where we wrote a little bit about the interactions between places and the art world, and places and identity, and what's possible in various different places. And we based the format of this pamphlet. It folds up into 6 sections here. We based it on the exact size and specs of what they publish at the DeCordova, like the little map that you get when you visit the DeCordova Museum. We very much wanted to kind of sneak in format-wise to that situation. So that involved actually working with their corporate printers, which was very odd and difficult. We went to these meetings, and we're not used to working with that kind of printer, so it was kind of peculiar. And then this pamphlet was given out during the show with our work. And then I'm going to finish here with a little bit of some of the design writing that I do. I've just done some screen grabs, actually, because I don't live in Boston anymore, so my editor mails me the Globe, and I get it like a few weeks later. I'm very much committed to the newspaper. I think partly because I was a paper boy when I was young, and I just liked the idea of writing going out in a newspaper to a big audience. But of course, like everybody, I read it online now. So I just was going to briefly talk about a couple of pieces that I've done recently. This was my most recent one, which was about Norway's new currency. And what I wrote about was on the left there, the very abstract looking images. And the idea that I raised was that money actually never looks abstract. Like, money is one of the most visually conservative things that we have. Even stamps are very adventurous compared to money. Money always has a picture of some poet or president or the treasury or something, and then it's extremely ornate, obviously for counterfeiting reasons. But there's a kind of weird thing where money, because it's just printed on paper needs to constantly be reminding us that it's connected somehow to more stable things. And I found this very interesting because it was money kind of just cutting those ties, like money looking like computer stuff, money just not caring anymore about making that connection. So I thought it was actually quite a radical design, and I wanted to talk about that. Another piece I did recently was about what this movement called natural architecture, which describes a big variety of practices, but the main kind of ideas are using, making things by hand out of materials that are readily available. And it's this kind of thing that on the face of it seems really useful and environmentally smart and that kind of thing. But once I read through the whole book, I started to feel frustrated because it didn't really seem like a solution to any of our problems, environmental or otherwise, to like make things out of bamboo and twigs and stuff like that necessarily, because the problems are like way bigger than whether you make something by hand or not. And then one of the things I noticed in this book, weirdly, was that these things kind of looked like post-apocalyptic structures. So I had this very weird thought, which fortunately my editor at the Globe indulged, which was that this is really weird, actually. It's like people are unconsciously making these survivalist bunkers type structures because they know that this isn't gonna work. This is gonna not solve our problems, and then we're all gonna be in a state of nature, living in twig constructions. So that was another piece that I did, and miraculously that ended up in a newspaper. And then I wrote another piece recently. I've been writing a lot about sports, about America's soccer uniform. And as you guys probably know, the US is not like one of the great soccer nations. And the other thing is that the US is unique worldwide in that it changes its uniform radically every year. Brazil always has yellow tops, blue shorts. Germany has white tops, black shorts. Countries have these like very stable visual identities, and the US will come out with stripes one year, stars, then blue, then white, then red. And I started to think actually the US was trying to hide, like it was like a kind of an attempt to forget not doing very well year after year. It was like we don't know those other people from last year. So and then I wanted to bring it back to end to go back to EMIGRE. This was a later issue of EMIGRE, actually, which was when it was a design magazine officially. And interestingly, this is Zuzana Liszko, who was the famous typographer for EMIGRE and great typographer of the 90s. She made this font and then wrote this heritage thing in it, which I found quite interesting. So it kind of weirdly connected back to these original ideas that they had, which was, about making a magazine about what it felt like to be foreign and to not fit into a situation, which I think is, I think if you had to talk about like what my design approach might be or my design process, I think it ordinarily starts with some kind of feeling like that of not necessarily fitting in, or that there is a problem. And then also, I think a little bit unconventionally for design, if you think about design, I don't try to necessarily think about solving that problem, because oftentimes it's beyond my abilities, but I do like to kind of get close to it and make something that in some way reveals the nature of the problem, whether that's in painting, publishing, editing, whatever it may be. So that's what I know about my design process, and I'm hoping to figure out more in the next part. Thank you.
All right. Well, very good. I'm very glad that you got to the bits about,
Oh, sorry.
that's okay, about the currency design and the Burning Man structure.
Yes.
Because that gets at something that I think where you really are a designer about, and this is the way that a critic or an observer can be a designer of, and the problem to solve is what should people make of these things, these artifacts, these processes. And I think the most accessible one of the one we talked about was the architecture firm Snohetta, which designed that new currency for Norway. There's so much embedded in that one thing, it seems to me anyway. Of course, all my architect and design friends were just swooning over the idea that what if we applied the same level of design to something that everyone uses like currency as we do art museums and so forth. Wouldn't that be cool? And,
right.
And that was a pretty cool, that money captured the zeitgeist, I would say, of our age as well as any design I've seen recently.
No, it's true, yeah.
It's interesting though, because in the same way that we'll get to talking about this sort of natural versus man-made issue that comes with the big Burning Man structure, but it's funny, of all the times in human history to really decide to go all in on currency, like the same month or the same quarter that Apple Pay and all these things come out, I mean, currency is going to be, this is going to be like having a really modern typewriter, right?
Yeah.
It's funny that maybe people will start to think about dealing with this now, but it's at a moment when I wonder how germane it is.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very interested in those moments because it's like that moment is this weird gap opens up, and I guess that's what Snohetta realized, or the panel. I mean, maybe there are other designs like Snohetta's that get rejected, but Norway somehow approved this, which is miraculous. And I think you're right. I think it's partly because money is becoming less important somehow as a physical substance, so it has this kind of freedom. I think that happens a lot in printmaking, in various technologies. Yeah, some weird thing happens where a space opens up. The same thing is true with publishing right now, where, you know, obviously everything's moving digital. People's attention, people's time, money is all moving digital, and yet all these interesting things have started to happen in print publishing that aren't really conservative or traditional in any way, but it's kind of like the heat got taken off of them for a minute, so it becomes a creative space for some reason.
Well, it seems to me, I mean, this is something that has happened again and again in different products and industries over hundreds of years, it seems to me, is as soon as something is not actually the state of the art for solving the practical problem, let's say commerce, it can start to carry a whole different set of meanings. And it seems to me, this is exactly your point about the soccer uniforms, that for most of our history, how good the United States is in soccer mattered not at all, right? Now, our American football or baseball, God help us, don't you dare go changing. There was a tremendous psychological uproar in the 70s when baseball stadiums started to not look like baseball stadiums and baseball uniforms started to look, well, like Snohetta's design for the money. And people said, whoa, I can't handle that. This still means, those things are still carrying meaning. When money ceases to, in the same way, because it's on my phone, and when soccer never did. Sure, you can have the American team dressed like leprechauns. We don't care. That has no cultural problem. I mean, it is interesting.
Yeah, I mean, they didn't go quite to leprechauns, but there was a faux, I talk about this in the piece, there was a faux denim with stars design, and Brazil would never have that. Their identity really is connected to the uniform.
But it's a great point, because actually in regular life in Brazil, the way people dress in Brazil is way wilder, a much broader range than the average New Yorker.
No, it's true. Our adventurousness in soccer uniforms isn't due to a real adventurousness. I think it's exactly that someone had great freedom. I mean, actually, the fake denim uniform is ugly in a lot of ways, but it's an amazing uniform. I mean, nobody in fact talks about the 1994 Brazil uniform.
Because
yeah, they probably did well. I forget how they did, but they probably did well, and
Yeah.
they wore their ordinary uniforms. But everyone talks about this, Alexei Lalas and this like fake denim outfit. So yeah.
They beat Brazil beat Italy on penalty kicks, but that's
Oh, good.
just FYI. But it is true that probably Brazil more than any country, because it is. I mean, the connection to that meaning. This is where design is really interesting, I think, because it's not always obvious what things will matter, what visual, and this is where we're migrating towards the conversation about art versus design, which I think is a really relevant one for this audience. Mind you, these are mostly not design students per se; they're majors in other things. But the idea, and maybe you could give us your thoughts on this. I often talk about a meaningful difference between art and design. Artists have patrons, designers have clients. One is sort of proactive, the other is reactive.
Yeah,
does that distinction make sense for you?
Yeah, it does, but it's also one that I find myself not observing so much. I mean, one of the structural problems of art is that, yes, they're patrons, they're collectors, and one of the things that makes me uncomfortable about that arrangement is that I don't necessarily, although I do it, I don't necessarily like selling one thing for a lot of money to one other person. I like publishing because I like a situation where you can sell for $15, $20, $10 to a lot of different people. And so I like those kind of situations. One of the things I liked about EMIGRE was that it was this moment of the designer taking over the whole magazine. Not just being the guy who has to listen to the publisher,
right.
but thinks about the whole thing. So I like those kind of, on the design side, I'm interested in design that spills over, and then on the art side, I'm interested in people who do things that are not operating within that normal structure.
That distinction that you just made, I think, is a very good one, because the artist who makes a single painting that may, like the Giacometti sculpture and something else that just sold for record prices yesterday, a one-off thing, its value is very much tied to its being a one-off thing.
Right.
Well, in architecture, we deal with this all the time. The single Daniel Libeskind building or the prototype.
Right,
and we just had one of our most recent guests is a guy named Joe Tanny, who's one of the leading, perhaps the leading prefab architect in the United States and we had this conversation because his world, he lives at the intersection of the single object. At the end of the day, each one is a single thing. You don't buy an A32 or a B16 or something like that, the way you do an airplane or a car.
Right.
But you do buy something that's simply a customization of one of those prototypes.
Right.
Which is interesting. And, in the digital world, one can imagine publishing finding the third way at that intersection. I don't want a book. I appreciate, today, you've been talking about this very clearly. The difference between a book and a magazine, because a magazine feels like it is a more scalable, pluralistic kind of thing. Even though there can be multiple copies of each,
right.
It can handle more points of view, more ideas. Also, it seems that from a problem-solving standpoint, you looked at the art world and you identified two problems that needed to be solved, and that's why those books did well. I mean, you didn't maybe realize how much of a problem they were, unless you were just being falsely modest.
No, we did. I mean, but we thought. I mean, I think that was part of our trick, was that we took personal problems that we had, and we realized, well, my grandmother used to say that, like, if you notice, other people notice too. Like, so we were noticing, like, these were problems, and I mean, we did it on faith, but you're right. It turns out that they were community problems. Yeah. I mean,
one of those titles is so fantastic. If anybody has ever been friends with an artist or gone to art openings, hey, I like your work, is just like the default greeting.
Yeah.
Actually, inside I'm thinking, the sooner I get away from your work, the better I'll sleep tonight. But nevertheless, I say I like your work. So how do you have a productive, I haven't read your book, but I mean, how do you have a productive, real engagement with somebody where the manners that you were taught as a youngster are invading your ability to be straight with somebody?
Right, and I mean, one of the things we talked about in the book is that oftentimes manners exist precisely to structure honesty. And you signal, you know, when you're at someone's opening, it's not the time to say, hey, I really don't like your new direction.
Right.
You're totally screwing things up here, right? When you're at an opening, you just say, great stuff. One of the authors said, like, one of the neutral things you could say was, you've done it again. You know, it just sounds totally positive, but it may be, you know, not. And
it allows you to segue somewhere else later in private.
Exactly. And then if they really want to have a conversation, they will signal, an artist will signal, well, hey, tell me what you really think here. Come over to my studio. I really want to get your feedback, or whatever. There are like etiquette ways of saying, now is the time to criticize my work, or now is the time to really tell me. And if you don't observe those kind of things, if you show up at someone's opening and start telling them why their work is wrong or derivative or whatever, it's not fun for anyone. So yeah.
Well, your point about how society's rules and norms play a useful role even in a society that has more radical things going on. Indeed, many writers and artists have commented on this, this necessity that, you know, who was it? Balzac said something like this, that it was, I think it was Balzac who said, you know, he was extremely conservative in his life so that he could be radical in his art.
Yes.
But more recently, in the 70s, Richard Sennett, the great writer, wrote in The Fall of Public Man about how important artifice was in, I want to say, 19th century London and 18th century Paris, that because you were obliged to present yourself in such an openly fraudulent way, if I could say that, he would have said, you simply were acting. You either had, in 18th century Paris, you had powdered wig, you had makeup, you had incredible finery, all of which was because public life was a spectacle. And the existence of a spectacle and artifice made then honesty perhaps possible.
Right. I think that's true. I think oftentimes the structures aren't you know, oftentimes an apparent structurelessness will be really oppressive, actually. And then oftentimes an apparently quite rigid system is built that way in order to allow for like fluidity and interchange.
Well, this leads me then to a question that for me is one of the most dominant issues of 20th and 21st century modern art and modern culture, modern economic consciousness, everything, the notion of authenticity. Because at the end of the day, why would we get rid of structures? Let's say, why did we get away from powdered wigs? Why did we get away from the incredible formality? Why is it that we in the United States are actually, I would say, almost addicted to constant informality, ceaseless informality?
Yes.
Hi, I'm coming over to your house for dinner. I'll be wearing the sweatpants over the flip-flops.
Right.
Why is this? Well, you know, part of it is a lack of appreciation for the relationship maybe between structure and deviation, or between order and something else.
Yeah, one of the things too that people universally dislike about Americans is that we're oppressively nice. You know, this is one of the things that people, when they come to the U.S., they just think it's just so horrible.
Who are you to ask me to have a nice day?
So yeah, exactly. I live in New York, so it's hard to remember that. But this kind of thing of like you have to be nice, you have to be in a good mood, frustrates people.
Because it is seen perhaps as a barrier to any the potential for an authentic connection at some later date.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
It almost happens too quickly, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. So, well, I think that's really good stuff, because that's, you know, when we think about, you know, why do I think authenticity, and this is not a fresh thought, many people have said this, but you know, the obsession in the art world in the early 20th century and subsequently with nativist art, with that which was seen as not modern, not contemporary at all in one way or another, whether it was African art or whether it was some sort of tribalist kind of art or native art in whatever country, was seen as a relief from the standardization of mechanization and the fact that everything, so many of our aspects of our lives had become common, the same.
Well, that's one of the worst things that can happen, is that you take someone else's experience appropriated and call it authentic. I mean,
Right.
I think that's the big was, you know, the big mistake of all that, rather than looking at your own, you know, the nature of your own experience, I think, yeah.
Well, it's really interesting because, you know, as the world gets more and more sophisticated, we've had some of our other guests. It's so great to have a cross-section of guests, from artists to CEOs of advertising agencies to branding and positioning people and so forth, because you end up looking at these issues from multiple perspectives. The definition of empathy, by the way. And you know, you think about, you know, for people who shop, you know, on Newbury Street here, you know, I don't know if it's still there. I think the store still exists somewhere. There's a shop that embodies this, if you want to say, commodification of otherness, I would say a little bit, or attempts to, is a store called Anthropology.
Yes.
Not that there aren't many stores that do this, but it somehow seems to do so with the least self-consciousness possible, which is you go in and you're already a high-end customer, you're outfitted in things that have been purchased online from high-end things, and you're there looking at what appears to be a kind of handmade, one-of-a-kind farmer girl's dress on a tree branch with a rusted milk bucket next to it, and you go, yeah, for a few moments I can believe that this is an authentic experience. And you know, the job of the artist, the job of the critic maybe, is to help us break through that.
Yeah, I think there's a Tumblr, I guess you guys probably know, I know less about Anthropology the store than I do about the Tumblr. I think there's a Tumblr of
that highlights
people,
this?
or yes, I forget what it's called, but there's a very satirical.
Right.
I forget if it's called like Sociology or it's called something like that. Yeah.
Well, actually, you know, the great thing about the breadth of all the outlets available to people is that everybody can have one. And there's another one whose name I can't remember right now, but it makes fun of my world, which is, it shows desperately unhappy people in really, really austere, elegant, modern spaces.
Oh, yes.
It's like a visual map of psychiatric disorder, and it's very funny in that respect, right? How minimal, austere, and utterly devoid of human activity can I make this? But let me just ask you a couple of other questions. When we looked at the Uchronia, or that Burning Man wooden structure, it gets at, when I read, that's one of the pieces of yours that I read before this, and it's one of the ones that I think, you know, stimulated me to ask you to come as a guest, because you talk very clearly about the dilemma, and it's one that this audience, I think, could understand very much. This, you know, imagine being, let's say, 18 to 23 at Northeastern right now, the resurgent environmental movement, the resurgent focus on green and sustainable and all of this. And it begs, it's again one of these questions that has been with us forever, about the natural versus the man-made, about the rhetorical versus the meaningful, not that the two are mutually exclusive, but that they merely overlap, they're not the same. So Burning Man, what was the genesis of this wooden structure? What was its intention? And then what would you say was its actual, you know, how was it perceived, at least from your perspective?
Yeah, and I think what I did in the piece was talk about, you know, the whole movement, which might have been unfair because, of course, within any movement, everyone has their own kind of goals. I think with the structures at Burning Man, I mean, I guess one of my problems was with this idea that you needed to make a spectacle of nature in order to take it seriously, right? That just seemed to me to be a complete misunderstanding of how you should approach nature.
You had to monumentalize it.
Yeah, and a lot of these projects were in parks, and you know, and I was just thinking, you don't need to have an extra thing in the park that kind of announces itself. I mean, maybe you just need a sign or a park. You know, that's fine. It's already complete. And the same thing is true in Burning Man. The idea of taking all the stuff to the desert, bringing everyone there in this kind of pseudo-libertarian, like free space of like drug use and who knows what, right? That was like somehow like a connection to nature just struck me as being really off. And also as a kind of really, what did George Bush say? A misunderestimation of people and what we're totally capable of, which is connecting to nature and thinking about it. I don't think that's not even the problem when it comes to environmentalism. I don't think the problem is that we don't connect to nature. I think most of us do and would like to more. So that's already, there's already one mistake. But then the second mistake is that somehow a gigantic structure made out of twigs that you light on fire would somehow, remind you about trees or something like that.
Right.
It didn't seem like a very useful or very unsustainable kind of thing too. Like, because would you have to have these like every 5 minutes or like on this? People constantly saying like, look at nature. It's a.
What is my attention span? How often do I need to be reminded of it with a giant conflagration?
Right. And that is not going to solve climate change.
Burning lots of things, you're arguing, is not good.
Exactly.
Okay.
That's exactly my argument. Yeah.
Okay.
Burning nature is not.
Okay. Well, I'm going to have to go back to, as the founder of that movement, I'm going to have to go back to the drawing board. But now it does, I don't know if you're familiar with this, there's a real architectural analog, though, to that very form that is, and in fact, when I first glimpsed your piece, I thought it was about this thing.
Oh.
And have you seen, there's an incredible canopy, public civic canopy made of wood I think it's in Sevilla, Spain. Somebody in the audience can correct me. It's by Jürgen Meyer, a German architect who has done this thing that's just kind of shocking. It is a laser cut, digitally conceived and manufactured wooden cloud-like form, three-dimensional kind of plywood truss that covers a very large public area in Spain, more than just a plaza, but and it protects. It's in southern Spain, I'm pretty confident, and therefore there's tremendously hot sun, and so it actually creates a shaded environment for a significant part of this in a historic town. And I thought, now there is a designed alternative to the rhetorical thing that you're showing, and if we'd talked about this beforehand, I might have inserted an image just so that you could juxtapose them, because it's interesting. In some ways, I think it's claiming a bit of the same rhetorical ground, i.e. this is made of wood, it's not made of high-strength steel, it's not made of some, super material. This is stuff that has been around forever, and it's assembled by nuts and bolts, and so it's pretty straightforward. But here it is, it achieves this monumentality and this modernity in a historic place. It's kind of much more discussable.
Right. Yeah, and I like that. I mean, that would be fine. And it also seems like it may do something very useful without announcing itself as natural necessarily. I mean,
and maybe one thing we could kind of close in on before we open it up for questions is this issue of, it's not often, actually, by the way, with our guests, that we don't explicitly use the terms empathize, define, ideate, prototype, and test. But I would say that you did do that in your publications, clearly. The empathy was about being of the art world and just listening to your grandmother and hearing that people, if you're thinking it, other people are thinking it too.
Yeah.
But these broader themes, like the natural versus the man-made, I constantly struggle with, especially now that the environmental movement there's a big, strong push, quite understandably, in our urban landscape and coastal development and all kinds of things that have to do with really the threshold between untamed nature, i.e. the rising oceans, and how do we accommodate that, live with it? Do we build a wall? So the natural and the man-made seem to have a particularly serious, real-world, unavoidable context now. I wonder if you think about that at all.
Well, yeah, the thing I do, the thing that the term, there's one term that I find very useful with this relatively like sort of trendy term, Anthropocene, which people are using now, which means to describe a whole era of I guess like a geologic era or like an era of the environment, which is man-made.
Right. While man has been here.
No, but now the idea is that, but basically we're going to now be living in a climate that we've created.
Okay.
So it actually flips, and that's what's really scary, is that it flips the whole situation around. The reason the ocean is rising is because of things that we did.
Right.
And so that really flips the whole kind of, that whole binary that we're used to, right? That we have to tame nature or whatever. No, actually, the strange thing now, the really difficult thing is that we've made nature do these things, and now we have to contend with it. So that's how I think that everyone has to kind of reconceptualize that problem, because, and that's why I was frustrated with the idea that like going back to nature or something like that is going to solve it, because that just seems like not useful.
There's one more image that we're not showing that I'm going to refer to, which I realize is bad pedagogy, but there's a great photograph in just a one-page essay in Architectural Record or something like that 10 years ago, 15 years ago. And it is brilliant. It encapsulates exactly what you just said. It's an aerial photograph of an extensive suburban development. Every house is the same on undulating cul-de-sac streets. It's exactly the same. And then in the middle, there's a little park. And the question, the caption is, which is natural and which is man-made? And the answer is, of course, that the natural thing, the thing that will continue if nothing is done, is the housing. And the man-made thing, is the artificial thing, is this small park that must be tended and watered and cultivated in order for it to survive. And I agree with you completely that this is an age that we are entering. And it's not going to happen on one day. This was already being written about 10 or 15 years ago, but it seems, with climate change, it seems more pressing and unlikely to suddenly reverse course. So well, that's super interesting. I think the eclectic nature of your talk was really excellent, and you're the first person we've had who really has been involved in the foregrounding the writing and communication of the work for a non-commercial audience. And so, I think that's something that the students can take away. Is we've had a lot of really brutal, bone-crunching business strategy and advertising strategy, like this is how you get them to think this. But this is, I loved your separation of the commercial art press. This might have been passed over in the earlier part of the talk. There's two parallel worlds, and they get along just fine, I guess. Well, maybe don't get along perfectly, but they coexist. The commercial art world and the aesthetic art world, or whatever you would call it. The academic art world. But I guess most observers would say, if they ever overlapped more, they have for a long, long time been super far apart. And now is one of those times where the things that are valued in the commercial art world are often completely eschewed by the academic art world. Do you see yourself, as you move forward in your career, do you see yourself continuing to navigate that space between those two?
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, part of the way I navigate it is that I have interactions on both sides. I mean, I teach at universities, I sell my work, there's no, so in that sense, it's just continuing to hold that position and try to figure out, what's most useful in any given situation. Because obviously with the, both realms have tremendous use and tremendous potential. It was just that with the publishing, we felt like there were things that were getting, a lot was happening in the interchange that wasn't getting recorded. So.
Right. Well, I think that's a great solution to a problem that maybe hadn't been clearly identified. Before we close, do we have any questions from the students? Our regular Twitter receiver isn't here. I don't know if one of the other TAs is receiving the Twitter feed today. If there is one, do we know? No, there aren't. Okay. With that, then, thank you, Dushko.
Thanks so much.
Thanks very much for coming.